Hello ladies and gentlemen, today we're back in Warthund looking at another French aircraft. This is the LeO 451 Early and it is at rank 2 battle rating 3.0. It is pretty much the most medium bomber you get in the French tree. If we look at its armor, it has 2 points of armor. One is the chair behind the pilot, which is not exactly the same size as the chair, which is kind of weird. If you actually look at where the driver sits, or the pilot sits, and then you can see the model of the chair in game, it doesn't actually cover the whole chair, which is kind of odd. It's smaller than it, but it's still there. The back gunner also has a bit of coverage of the 12mm variety, and it will cover his legs, so he'll get shot in the head, but that's okay because his legs will still be intact. If we look at the armament of this machine on the X-ray, it is actually formed with a offensive 7.5mm MAC machine gun, which is kind of useful because you can kill light targets with it. It has 1500 rounds, which is pretty good, and gives you at least some kind of offensive role. If we look at the defensive armaments on this machine, you are equipped with a 20mm Hispano 404 with 120 rounds, and then in a little bay down here, we have a 7.5mm MAC machine gun, which can come in handy if people attack you from below. Just to let you know, this is actually a little retractable turret. Unfortunately, in game at this moment in time, it isn't retractable, but hopefully in the future, we'll see something similar to what we see in like the P108, where it actually goes into the machine. So with the Hispano on top, it pretty much has very similar coverage to the other guns that we see in that position, where basically it goes from tail to tail and a little bit higher than that. If we look at the engines, it has the Gnome Roan 14N 39s, which pretty much means this is the production variant of the LeO 451. We'll get into the historical stuff in a little bit, but yeah. Basically, the Hispano Souzas were used on the prototype and the test version, and then the Gnome Roans were switched in during production. The wings are also made out of fuel tanks. They are self-sealing, which is kind of nice, but they still set on fire, and they don't seal quick enough for your wing to not snap off. It seems to have incredibly weak wings when it comes to it, but with a max speed of around about 500 kilometers an hour, with war emergency power as well, it's okay in the maneuverability and speed department. But once again, we'll get into that in a little bit. The modifications for the machine are kind of interesting. So you start off with 1650s, which is about 8 100s. You can upgrade to 7 100s if you feel like, which you actually get a lot less explosive mass. So therefore, you don't really need that. The next upgrade is 1 100 and 6 200s, which is a big upgrade compared to the 1650s. And then the last one, which is just kind of all over the place, 4 200s, 1 100 and 2 500s, which is definitely the bomb load you should be rocking. It comes in three bomb bays, one on each wing on the side, and then one in the center, which is kind of nice to see. Has a really nice interaction through the thing. But anyway, let's talk about upgrades. So the first thing that you're probably going to realize is that there are a hell of a lot of upgrades, which means that they are very important in what you want to go for first. So first of all, with the turrets, the 7.5mm is pretty useless on default rounds, and that's the same for the offensive 7.5. So if you want to go for the offensive belts first, if you're going to use this in more of an attacker role, I'd definitely say go for the belts and then go for the bomb line, and then focus on the flight performance. The flight performance upgrades on this aircraft don't really matter that much. Stock, it does still have a decent speed behind it, and also it isn't really going to help you on maps that you struggle with. So stuff like El Alamein, you're still not going to be able to get to the targets before P-47s get at you. So generally, it's actually much better to focus on the weaponry side of the stuff. Survivability, it hasn't helped me. This thing falls apart in a few shots. but overall the weaponry is something to go for. And you'll realize a big difference between this bomb load and all the rest, and I tell you what, you'll probably love it. So focusing on these to try and keep you alive, and also getting that 500 GPS, then you can work on your flight performance after you're able to get your bombs off and stuff like that. But anyway, we're going to do some historical stuff and also get into some gameplay. I do have quite a bad flu right now, so if there are breaks in the commentary for like 5 or 10 seconds, don't worry about it, I will come back. I'll see you in the historical part. So the Olivier LeO 451, it was considered the best medium bomber that the French actually had in the Battle of France in 1940. And the reason it came about is because the Armée de l'Air decided that they wanted a 5-seat bomber, which was issued in 1934. And from this, the LeO 45 was created. It was a very streamlined twin-engine bomber, which had 2 Hispano-Suiza engines in it. This then spawned the prototype of the LeO 45.01, which made its maiden flight on the 16th of January 1937, and was seen as a success, but the engines themselves did overheat a little bit. So then work continued on the LeO 45.01 for the prototype for more than a year, and then in August of 1938 they decided that they wanted to swap the engines to the Gnome 14N radial engines. These are the engines that we see in-game on the LeO 451. So the prototype began flight tests in the October of 1938, and on the flight test program it was continued until February 1939. And basically the Armée de l'Air decided that they were going to throw a bunch of contracts on very different aircraft. So the LeO 450, the LeO 452, which we don't have in game, but maybe at some point we will. So then they were orders for 20 aircraft in November 1937, and then in March 1938, 20 again. There was another large order for 100 aircraft in June of 1938, with an option for another 100 aircraft. And then in 1938, the revised prototype entered testing, and then all of the orders from the LeO 450, 452 were switched to the LeO 451. So they were so impressed with the prototype of the LeO 451.01, they decided to scrap everything else and work exactly just on this machine. So the second order for 100 was confirmed, so this overall is 240 aircraft were ordered by February 1939, and then they decided in that February that they were going to order 480, so they were backing this thing to the hilt. And eventually that order was placed in April that year of 1939. So more orders were then placed again, and overall they were looking for 1,548 of these aircraft. Obviously this didn't come about, but you know, the intention shows that they really believed in this thing. So one of the biggest issues the French had in general was the engines of their aircraft. You'll also find this with other nations such as Italy, especially with the Italian tanks. And because they decided to change from the Hispano-Suizas to the Gnome 14Ns, that meant that production was delayed by quite a bit. So the first production aircraft was supposed to be delivered in May 1938, but the first LeO 4511, which is what we have in the game in the form of the 451 early, made its maiden flight on the 24th of June 1939, even though it was also displayed at the French Air Show, or the Paris Air Show, in November 1938. So one of the biggest issues that this thing ran into was the limited number of Gnome Rhone air screws. They were replaced by 1634 or 1635 Ratia air screws, and these were designed to be the most efficient at 2,200 RPM. The issue was the Gnome Rhone engines were at their best at 2,400. So they had to limit the engines a little bit, which meant that so did the top speed, and it went down to 298 miles per hour from 311 miles per hour. But after all of that, the LeO 451 was made, and it was able to carry what you see in game and also had the armament as well. With the actual service of the aircraft comes some unfortunate tales. So by the time of the summer of 1939, there wasn't really a lot produced. Basically, because of the engine issues, it took a very long time to get these things in the air. 8 took part in the Bastille Day celebrations of July 1939, and that was although only 2 of them had officially been accepted by the Armée de l'Air by the end of that month. So once again, the air shows kind of showing something, and the Armée de l'Air doing something different. On the 3rd of September 1939, the number on charge had risen to 10, so we had 10 active aircraft by September 1939, and 22 had been delivered. The aircraft was in service with an evaluation flight that had been established at Reims using crews of the group de bombardement of the 1st 31st. So overall, before the French armistice, 449, some sources do say 452 LeO 451s were completed. So the initial order of overall, what was it, 1,548, you basically have a third of that being completed instead of the full amount, which obviously is a trend we've seen with other French aircraft of that time. By the time of the 10th of March 1940, only 106 of these were actually accepted into the Air Force, and by the 10th of May, the number had actually doubled, so 222. So when the German offensive actually began, there was about 222 of the LeO 451 which were operational in France, or at least in the French Air Force. So even then, with 222 available, only 94 aircraft were in frontline services, and only 54 were actually survivable. So you have about 54 aircraft to your disposal instead of 222. Another 22 were actually part of the French Air Force Reserve, and the rest were either being repaired or modified. Remember, as I said, they had to change the engines and also change specific things to be able so they could maybe fly reconnaissance and stuff like that. So the first time the LeO 451 actually entered service in the GB 1st to the 31st, or the I-31st, the unit was 5 LeO 451s and 8 Block 200s, which hopefully we see the blocks in game at some point. I'm sure we will. And what they did is they flew a reconnaissance flight over Germany, basically to see what the Germans had planning. One of them was lost to enemy action on the 6th of October, and in the action, LeO 451s actually showed they were pretty nippy. They survived 2 attacks from Bf-109Es. Even though they did take damage, they were still able to survive, which was nice. And then the one solitary one was shot down by flak, unfortunately. So in the winter of 1939 to 1940, if the French group did not operate the Farman F222 or the AMIO 143, which is another plane hopefully we see in game at some point, the bomber groups were withdrawn and then equipped with LeO 451s, or at least that was the idea. So what they had was 27 aircraft for a total of 10 groups, or 5 escadre, or escad, however you say it, with 135 aircraft. So they had 135 of these LeOs in total by the time of winter 1939 to 40. So the target that was the target which they aimed for. Unfortunately, once again, this was not achieved. So the slow production and delaying preparation for the aircrafts meant that by the March of 1940 they had 59 aircraft, and by the 10th of May they had 94, which 54 were serviceable. So on the 10th of May, 3 home-base bombing groups, the first 12th, the second 12th, and the first 31st, were fully equipped with the new aircraft, and the first 11, second 11, first 23, second 23, second 31 were in the process of converting and still had a number of Block 210s. So this is May 1940 we're talking about, and this is supposed to be the cream of the crop bomber, and they just didn't have enough of them. But the first combat of the European war for these LeO 451s came on the 11th of May. It was an attack on some German columns in Belgium. It was a low-level attack by 10 aircraft, and it didn't exactly go very well. So 1 aircraft was shot down, all 9 suffered heavy damage from ground fire, and only 1 of the original 10 aircraft was airworthy on the 12th of May. So basically, they lost 1 aircraft, 8 of them were downed because they needed so much repairs, and 1 of them survived, so, you know, good for it. Reinforcements then arrived on the 15th of May, and that meant that more squadrons had more of these machines to their disposal, and the group once again suffered heavy losses over the next few days, basically trying the same thing. And on the 21st of May, after only 10 days of combat, the entire groupement had to move south to regroup, showing that they took so many losses from these low-level attack flights, which should have kind of showed to them this probably isn't a great idea, but they still tried. So the group, first of the 11th and second of the 11th, took their LeO 451s into combat on the 25th of May, attacking another German column. They were joined by the second 23rd, but a shortage of aircraft meant that the first 23rd had to hand over its LeO 451s and resume operations with the Block 210. So they still didn't have enough aircraft by this point. The Groupement 6 returned to operations on the 28th, which was the group which pretty much got slaughtered on the 11th to the 15th. But then on May 31st, 9 of the 20 aircraft dispatched to attack German positions around Amiens and Abbeville were lost. So that's nearly a 50% loss rate just on that one mission. So instead of doing day missions where they were seeing a lot of losses, they switched to night operations, and you know, this is where stuff like the POTES comes in that we talked about before. But the critical situation meant that respite was only temporary, and by the 6th of June the unit had been forced to return to daylight operations to try and support the retreating French armies, but not to a great avail. So by the time of the 14th of June, the situation had gone from bad to worse, so the LeO 451 groups were ordered to prepare to retreat to North Africa. So Groupement 6 moved to Istres, while other units moved to Bordeaux, and then on the 17th, Groupement 7 and 11 were ordered to fly to North Africa, leaving only 4 LeO 451s equipped groups of Groupement 6 still in France. And then on the 24th of June, 11 aircraft from this groupement flew the last LeO 451 sorties of the 1940 campaign, an attack on bridges at Solbrenner and Culo. So the French armistice came into effect on the 25th of June 1940, and by this date 130 LeO 451s were lost to all causes, and 373 aircraft had been accepted by the Armée de l'Air and Aéronaval, and just over 200 aircraft were serviceable. So they pretty much lost about a third of their fighting power by the time of the armistice of the LeOs, and the rest, or at least the majority, were in North Africa at this point. So then we move on to Vichy. So the LeO 451 was one of those aircraft that the Vichy government was allowed to operate. So in September 1940, 7 groups were operating the type, most of them based in North Africa. The aircraft was soon in action against their former allies. On the 23rd and 24th, 4 LeO 451s bombed Gibraltar, in reprisal for the unsuccessful Allied attack on Dakar. And then 451s were also used once again against the Allies during the campaign in Syria in the summer of 1941. 3 LeO 451 groups moved to Syria to take part in the campaign. 28 aircraft were lost during the fight in Syria, 5 in the air, 11 in accidents, and 12 on the ground. So a bit of a better rate of attack compared to the French campaign, but still not great. In 1941, the Vichys updated the aircraft, so they added larger vertical tail surfaces. The 20mm was replaced by one carrying 2 7.5mm machine guns and one 20mm cannon. The Germans allowed the Vichy government to restart production of the 451, and on the 20th of August 1941, they contracted for 225 of these new aircraft. A lot of them were actually tried to be built from existing 451s and tried to be put together, but this new aircraft with the different guns made its maiden flight in the 16th of December 1941. So that's probably going to be the late version that we see in the game. That's why we have the LeO 451 early. I'm guessing this is going to be the late version. But anyway, moving on to the Axis. The Axis pretty much used them as transport planes because they just didn't see really any use for them. They also used them for training. The Free French used them in North Africa, or at least tried to, until they were replaced by Handley Page Halifaxes when they were shipped to Britain, and also the last of the LeO 451 units converted to Marauders in September 1943. Surprisingly, 67 of the LeO 451s actually survived the Second World War, 45 in North Africa and 22 in France. So even though a lot of them were in a pretty poor state, a lot of them were actually refurbished, and they were used as test beds for the 451E, and we used to test out different weapons, so mainly air-launched rockets. That might be interesting if we see them. 3 were converted to LeO 455s, and they were used to test the Nomron 14R engines. It would be interesting if we see the 455. And then 40 were re-engined with Pratt & Whitney's and designated the LeO 453, a variant of aircraft which was used until 1957. So in the story of the 451, there are tons of different LeOs that we could see in game. The 453, the 455, the 450, obviously the 451.01, and the LeO 45 itself. So yeah, it's definitely an interesting aircraft. It didn't do very well in real life, which is a real damn shame since it was seen as the prominent bomber used by the French. I'm guessing a lot of it came down to tactics and misuse of this aircraft. But anyway, let's get into some gameplay. So the LeO 451 early in game is actually a pretty good bomber. What is nice about it is some characteristics which you generally don't get out of many bombers, and that's the fact that it has quite a versatile bomb load, it has pretty good defensive armament, and it has an offensive gun. Something that's always drawn me towards stuff like the Sparviero is just that single forward firing gun. And since this machine has a 7.5mm, it means that with its 1500 rounds you can take out soft ground targets all day if you feel like it. And with the bomb load, if you do get down tiered, you are able to take out 2 bases by yourself. If you stay at your tier or above, it's going to take you, you're probably going to get 1.5 bases. Something to also take into account is if you run the maximum bomb load, it has 3 I want to say bomb holsters, but that's obviously wrong. Bomb bays, there we go. And the center one drops first, so all of these smaller bombs that you get do drop before you drop the 500 kilos. Definitely something to take into account if you're going after smaller targets such as light pillboxes. Generally, I do go after bases in this machine, but at higher altitudes and also lower ones, going after light pillboxes and medium tanks and heavy tanks, it's very easy to do. it can be a bit daunting in this machine, going after targets low to the ground, because first of all, it gets chewed up hard. So if an AA decides that it wants to eat you alive, it will do. This thing does not have a lot of armor on it, and it's made of fuel in its wings. So one hit on the wings and, well, you'll be set on fire, and that just isn't going out. Even though they're self-sealing, their wings are too weak in order to hold it before the fire goes out. I've never had a fire go out in this thing before a wing has ripped off. If we talk about the Hispano in the back, it has decent coverage. It is limited to the wings of the tail, so if you are attacking it, just take that into account. And the 7.5mm can actually catch people off guard who are trying to attack you. And you can do a little bit of bomber hunting if you feel like it. Something that is a bit different to some of the other French aircraft is the fact that this machine doesn't dive too well. For some reason, when you reach Mach 0.5, it decides to tell you to reduce speed, and you redline at a very low speed compared to some of the other French bombers, which is sad because the maneuverability of this aircraft is good, the bomb load of this aircraft is good, the defensive armament is good enough, it has good combat flaps and everything like that, but its speed is what lets it down. So if you have a fighter which has decided it's going to go after you, which does happen quite a lot in this aircraft, you're gonna die. There is no getting away from it unless it decides to turn off. In some of the other French aircraft, you can actually dive away quite well, but in the LeO that's just not going to happen. I don't know whether it's because of its engines or whether it's something else. I have no idea. Talking about its engines, one of the weird things that I found in this aircraft, but not any other from the French, is the fact that its engines do overheat quite rapidly. The French in general, if we look at a lot of the fighters apart from the MB157, and we look at all of the bombers apart from this one, overheating isn't really an issue. You can kind of run your engines ragged without them really caring unless it's 15 or 20 minutes into a battle. With these engines, they will start overheating while you take off from the airfield if you are running wet. So it's definitely something you have to take into account while you're using it going down. So the bad things are low top speed and engines overheating. But engines you can deal with because you can just run it at 100 and they won't overheat. But the top speed really does make a difference, especially when you're trying to get out of the battle, which generally is something you want to do if you have already dropped your bomb load. Fighting is definitely something you can do. This isn't as good as some of the other aircraft which have better offensive armament, but if you feel like going after something like a Heinkel, you can definitely do that and do a lot of damage to it. I would definitely stay away from the BVs though, they'll tear you apart because they're very good at setting things on fire, unfortunately. But overall, I have enjoyed my time in this aircraft just because it feels much more like an attacker with a decent bomb load instead of a medium bomber which struggles in specific areas. The turret on the back, the Hispano, only having 120 rounds can catch you out. You'll be reloading and thinking, where did all my rounds go? But overall, the Hispano in general, especially in the turret form, the muzzle velocity is so high, I found it pretty good as long as you get the upgrade for it so it doesn't just fire like a shotgun and it actually fires in a straight line. Landing it is completely fine. Unfortunately, you'll see me kind of cock it up here, but well, I think this is the one where I cock it up. But overall, it's quite easy to land, and you do have access to landing flaps. No air brake. I haven't found a single French aircraft with an air brake yet. But, you know, you never know. I'm sure the jets have them. When it comes to losing speed, I have found it is one of the worst bombers to lose speed in, and that's probably because of its very nice airframe, which is obviously designed to cut through the air. This is a thin aircraft, very streamlined. So, in order to land, you do have to put down your massive landing flaps and gear. But overall, it's still quite easy to land, apart from if you come in a little bit hard and you smash your tail on the ground. So yeah, do watch out for that. And obviously around this BR, it can be incredibly daunting for any French bomber because, well, BVs exist, and generally they get to your airfield while you also land on your airfield, so just watch out for the bombs, which are generally around the place. There's not a lot you can do about them, but still. It's very hard to say that you should miss this aircraft, just because of its decent bomb load and all of its good features. I mean, it really doesn't have that many bad features to it which make you hate an aircraft, or it doesn't really have any real bad matchups. Every fighter that the Italians and Germans can throw at you are going to be really good, but at least you have a Hispano to fend them off, which is more than good enough to knock pilots or knock engines, which can be very satisfying. You're never going to be as good as a BV because nothing is at this BR, and it's just something you're going to have to deal with. So we're going to WEP off the ground here, and basically show how the engines overheat just after you get off the ground, which is a very sad thing, unfortunately. Hopefully, I don't know if it is supposed to be like that, but it's just weird how it only happens with this aircraft and nothing else, even though the other aircraft do have the same engines. I'm guessing they have different radiator, or the different oil and water cooling systems. Maybe that's what happens, I don't know. But as you can see, just taken off, and the engines are already red. Very odd. But then I missed the BF-109, he sets me on fire with one hit, hitting one of those massive fuel tanks, and well, we're going down because, well, fires just don't go out in this thing. But anyway, I hope you all have a wonderful day, and I'll see you next time.